History loves a hero, and few stories sound more heroic than this. America, victorious and wealthy, extends a generous hand to its defeated enemies and exhausted allies. $13 billion, roughly $1 trillion in today's money, poured into war-shattered Europe. Democracy saved, communism contained, gratitude eternal. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Marshall Plan is taught as pure altruism, a triumph of American generosity, the economic miracle that rebuilt Europe after World War II and prevented the spread of Soviet communism. Secretary of State George Marshall even won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, the only general in history to receive that honor. But there's another story hiding beneath the surface, one about control disguised as charity, about economic dominance dressed up as friendship, and about how the most successful propaganda campaign in modern history convinced the world that American self-interest was selfless compassion. Let's start with a number that almost no one discusses: 5%. That's how much of Marshall Plan funds went directly to the CIA, nearly $700 million, funneled through something called the Office of Policy Coordination. The money financed secret operations across Europe, funding newspapers, student groups, labor unions, intellectuals, and artists, all to counter Soviet influence, yes, but also to ensure that European politics aligned with American interests. This wasn't Reconstruction. It was ideological engineering on a continental scale. The stated goal was to fight communism. The unstated goal was to build an economic empire without firing a shot. And unlike traditional empires that drained colonies, this one worked by making the colonies dependent, willingly. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Europe was already recovering before Marshall Plan money arrived. By the end of 1947, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom had restored production to pre-war levels. Belgium followed shortly after. Industrial output across Western Europe was climbing. The recovery had begun, not because of American dollars, but because European nations still had their infrastructure, their educated populations, and their industrial know-how largely intact. A study from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis found something startling. Net capital did not flow into Europe during Reconstruction. If Marshall Plan aid had been crucial, Europe should have run massive trade deficits, importing machinery and goods they couldn't yet produce. If Marshall Plan aid had been crucial, that didn't happen. Europe was rebuilding itself. So why did America push so hard to give aid that wasn't strictly necessary? Because the plan was never primarily about reconstruction. It was about preventing Europe from choosing economic models that didn't serve American interests. The conditions attached to the money tell the real story. Recipients had to agree to free market reforms, reduce trade barriers, balance their budgets, and abandon any socialist economic policies they'd adopted. The aid pushed European political economies toward what Washington called a mixed economy with more market, meaning less government control, more openness to American investment. Britain discovered this the hard way. In exchange for Marshall funds, London had to maintain adequate currency reserves, modernize management practices, and agreed to American oversight of their economic policies. When Britain tried to negotiate the terms, the message was clear: accept the conditions or lose the money. One British newspaper asked pointedly, "Can we afford Marshall Plan aid?" The strings were so tight that accepting help meant surrendering pieces of sovereignty. And this wasn't an accident. It was the design. Consider West Germany, the biggest winner of the Marshall Plan, receiving more aid than almost anyone. But Germany wasn't just being rebuilt, it was being weaponized. American planners wanted a strong West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. A prosperous, capitalist Germany would serve as a rebuke to communist East Germany, and proof that the American system worked better. So aid flowed disproportionately to German industry, railways, and infrastructure. France protested. They'd been invaded by Germany twice in 30 years and didn't want to see their former enemy rise again. But their security concerns were overruled. America needed Germany strong, regardless of what France feared. The War Department's preference for revitalizing Germany won out, even at the expense of French interests. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic positioning in an emerging Cold War. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. The Marshall Plan worked exactly as intended, but not because it rebuilt Europe. Economists still debate how much the aid actually contributed to recovery. The aid represented less than 3% of recipient nations' combined income over 4 years. That would translate to a GDP boost of perhaps 0.3%, hardly the miracle it's made out to be. What the Marshall Plan really achieved was political control and market access. American products flooded European markets. American corporations gained footholds across the continent. American economic doctrine, free markets, minimal government intervention, and openness to foreign investment became the default setting for Western European capitalism. The plan didn't save Europe, It integrated Europe into an American-led economic order. And it worked so well that 70 years later, Europe still struggles with that dependency. The goal was to reduce America's security burden by making Europe self-sufficient. That never happened. NATO still exists. American troops are still stationed across the continent. The dependency remains. But perhaps the greatest trick of the Marshall Plan was its branding. Washington launched a domestic propaganda campaign to sell the program to skeptical American taxpayers. They called it the European Recovery Program and framed it as humanitarian aid. Posters showed grateful Europeans. Films emphasized American generosity. Politicians stressed the moral duty to help, and it worked. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support. Americans believed they were saving Europe out of compassion, not realizing they were financing the construction of a global economic empire that would benefit American corporations for generations. Meanwhile, the Soviets saw it clearly. Moscow rejected the plan not because they didn't need the money, but because they recognized the political strings attached. Accepting aid meant opening their economies to American oversight, abandoning central planning, and allowing Western influence into their sphere. Stalin understood. This wasn't charity. It was a Trojan horse, and he was right. So what's the lesson hidden in this 75-year-old story? The Marshall Plan wasn't evil. It genuinely did help stabilize Europe. It did prevent chaos, but it never was what we were told it was. It was economic statecraft disguised as altruism. A strategic investment that returned dividends for decades. The construction of soft power so effective that most people still don't recognize it as power at all. And that's the real genius of it. The best forms of control don't look like control. They look like help. The strongest chains are the ones people put on willingly, believing they're gifts. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll shape your world without you even noticing. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look. Subscribe. History has the answers.
This gave you a new perspective? Hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.